The whispers began the moment Eleanor Ashford stepped into the drawing room of Hartley Manor, her childhood home, exactly 3 months after burying her husband. She wore black, as was expected, but there was something in the set of her shoulders, something in the unwavering directness of her gaze, that made the assembled relatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her mother sat rigid near the fireplace, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Her brother Thomas stood by the window with his arms crossed, while her uncle, Lord Hartley, occupied the place of honor in the largest chair, his jowls trembling with barely contained outrage. They had summoned her here to discuss her future, to guide her, as they said, toward the proper path for a young widow of quality. What they expected was submission, tears perhaps, and certainly gratitude for their concern. What Eleanor gave them instead was a quiet, devastating announcement that would shatter every expectation they held. She would not be retiring to the dower house to live out her days in mourning obscurity. She would not be placing the Ashford estates into the hands of a male trustee, and she certainly would not be seeking their permission for what she intended to do next. She was going to run everything her late husband had left behind: the factories, the farms, the investments in the new railway lines, and she was going to do it herself. The shock in that room was absolute, but it was nothing compared to the scandal that erupted across London's drawing rooms in the days that followed. Eleanor had committed what society considered an unforgivable transgression. She had refused to disappear. Widowhood, especially for a woman of her age and station, was meant to be a kind of social death, a graceful retreat into the shadows where one became a living memorial to the departed. But Eleanor Ashford had looked at the empire her husband built and seen not a monument to be preserved in amber, but a living, breathing enterprise that required intelligence, courage, and vision to sustain. Christopher had been a good man, far better than most husbands of his rank, and he had seen something in Eleanor that her own family never had: her sharp mind, her head for figures, her genuine concern for the people who worked their lands. In the private hours of their marriage, he had shared with her his dreams for modernizing their holdings, for treating their workers with dignity, for investing in the future rather than clinging to the past. He had never imagined he would die at 32, thrown from his horse during what should have been an ordinary autumn hunt, leaving Eleanor alone to face a world that would see her competence as an abomination. Eleanor had loved Christopher, not with the desperate passion of novels, but with a deep respect and genuine affection that had grown over their 7 years together. Theirs had been an arranged match, as most were, but it had blossomed into something rare, a partnership. Now he was gone, and she was left with a choice. She could become what they wanted: a decorative relic, a cautionary tale, a woman whose life effectively ended at 25, or she could honor Christopher's memory by doing what he would have wanted. She could be brave. She chose bravery, and it cost her everything she had known. Her mother refused to receive her. Her brother publicly stated he no longer recognized her as his sister. Invitations ceased to arrive. Former friends crossed the street to avoid greeting her. And yet with each morning that dawned, Eleanor rose, dressed, and went to the study that had been Christopher's, where she pored over ledgers, met with stewards, and made decisions that proved again and again that she was more than capable of the task she had claimed. The criticism reached a crescendo when the most powerful voice in English society joined the chorus of condemnation. Sebastian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenscroft, was everything Eleanor was not: ancient title, vast wealth, unquestioned authority, and a reputation for rigid adherence to tradition that bordered on obsession. He was also a widower, though his loss was 4 years past, and unlike Eleanor, he wore his grief like armor, using it to justify his inflexible views on propriety and duty. The Ravenscroft lands bordered the Ashford holdings, and Sebastian had tolerated Christopher's progressive ideas with barely concealed disdain during his lifetime. But a widow managing estates, involving herself in commerce, meeting with bankers and railway investors? This was beyond the pale, a corruption of everything Sebastian believed society should be. When he learned that Eleanor had personally negotiated a contract for coal delivery to one of her factories, saving hundreds of pounds and securing better wages for the miners, he decided he could remain silent no longer. He would confront this reckless woman, and he would make her see reason. The confrontation came at Lady Pemberton's evening salon, one of the few social events Eleanor still attended, held by one of the few hostesses brave enough to include her name on an invitation list. Sebastian approached her with the cold courtesy of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty, his tall frame imposing, his dark eyes devoid of warmth. Every head in the room turned to watch as the Duke of Ravenscroft spoke to the scandalous Viscountess Ashford, his words measured but unmistakably harsh. He suggested, in tones that made it sound like a command, that she was dishonoring her husband's memory with her unfeminine pursuits. He implied that her judgment was clouded by grief and inexperience. He made it clear, without quite saying it directly, that he found her behavior not just inappropriate, but personally offensive. Eleanor listened with her chin raised and her hands steady, and when he finished, she thanked him coolly for his concern and informed him that she had no intention of altering her course. She would continue to manage the Ashford estates, and she would do so without his approval or anyone else's. The battle lines were drawn, and Eleanor Ashford found herself standing utterly alone against the weight of an empire's disapproval, with the most powerful duke in England leading the charge against her. But she had made her choice, and she would not surrender no matter the cost. What neither she nor Sebastian could have known in that moment was that this was not an ending but a beginning, the first act of a story that would transform them both and prove that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with attraction but with opposition, and that the strongest partnerships are forged in the fire of mutual respect hard won. To understand how Eleanor Hartley became the woman who would defy an empire, one must travel back 7 years, to a spring morning when she was 18 and standing in the gardens of her father's estate, watching carriages arrive for what would be her first meeting with Viscount Christopher Ashford. She had known for months that a match was being arranged, that her family's dwindling finances required an alliance with newer money, and that Christopher, whose grandfather had made a fortune in trade before purchasing his title, needed the respectability her ancient bloodline provided. Eleanor had prepared herself for disappointment, perhaps even cruelty, having heard enough stories of loveless aristocratic marriages to temper any girlish fantasies. But when Christopher stepped down from his carriage, what struck her first was not his appearance, though he was handsome enough, but the kindness in his eyes when he bowed to her mother, the patience with which he listened to her father's pompous stories, and the gentle courtesy he extended to Eleanor herself, treating her not as a commodity being acquired, but as a person whose thoughts might actually matter. Their courtship had been brief but revealing. Christopher took her walking in his gardens and asked her opinions on everything from literature to estate management, seeming genuinely interested in her answers. He showed her the schools he had built for the children of his workers, the improved cottages he had constructed, the innovative farming techniques he was implementing. He confessed that he had no interest in a decorative wife who would smile and say nothing. He wanted a partner, someone with whom he could share the burden and joy of building something meaningful. Eleanor, who had spent her entire life being told that her intelligence was unfeminine and her questions inappropriate, found herself blooming under his attention like a plant finally given sunlight. When he proposed, she accepted not out of duty but out of hope, that perhaps her life might be more than the suffocating round of meaningless social rituals she had been raised to expect. Their wedding was grand, as befitted their stations, but Eleanor's happiest memory of that day was the quiet moment afterward when Christopher had taken her hand and promised that he would never ask her to be less than she was. The 7 years of their marriage had been the happiest of Eleanor's life, though they were not without sorrow. She had failed to conceive, and each passing year added weight to the whispered speculation that she was barren, that the Ashford line would die with Christopher. The doctors offered no explanations, only sympathetic looks and vague suggestions about rest and prayer. Christopher, to his eternal credit, never blamed her, never took a mistress as many husbands in his position would have done, never made her feel that her worth was contingent on producing an heir. Instead, he drew her deeper into his work, teaching her to read ledgers, to understand contracts, to see the intricate web of decisions that kept an estate prosperous. He introduced her to his banker, his solicitor, his most trusted stewards, making it clear that he valued her judgment. In the private sanctuary of their marriage, Eleanor discovered capabilities she had never been permitted to develop, and Christopher discovered that his unconventional choice of partner was the best decision he had ever made. When Christopher died, the loss was devastating not just emotionally, but practically. Eleanor had been his partner in every sense, but the law recognized her as nothing more than a dependent. The estates, the investments, everything was legally hers to hold, but not to manage without male oversight. The expectation was clear. She would appoint a trustee, likely her brother or uncle, who would make all decisions while she received an allowance and faded into comfortable obscurity. But Eleanor knew what would happen if she surrendered control. Her brother was a gambler who had already run through his own inheritance. Her uncle was a traditionalist who would undo every progressive reform Christopher had implemented, who would see the workers return to poverty and the investments liquidated for short-term gain. Christopher had built something good, something that provided livelihoods for hundreds of families, and Eleanor could not bear to watch it destroyed by men who saw only profit and propriety. So she made her decision in the quiet of Christopher's study, surrounded by his books and his maps and the memories of their conversations about the future. She would not let his legacy die. She would not betray the trust he had placed in her. She would step into the role society said she could not fill, and she would prove them all wrong no matter what it cost her. It cost her everything she had known, but Eleanor Ashford was about to discover that sometimes losing everything is the price of becoming who you were always meant to be. The first months of Eleanor's new life were a baptism by fire that would have broken a lesser woman, but she met each challenge with a determination that surprised even herself. She rose before dawn each day, meeting with stewards and tenant farmers who arrived expecting to deal with a confused widow, and instead found a woman who knew exactly how many acres of barley had been planted, which drainage ditches needed repair, and what fair wages should look like. She rode out to inspect the factories Christopher had invested in, ignoring the shocked stares of workers who had never seen a lady of quality navigate the muddy yards where coal was unloaded and machinery thundered. She sat in meetings with bankers who spoke to her as if she were a child, their condescension barely masked, and she responded with figures and projections so precise that their smug expressions slowly shifted to grudging attention. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every success attributed to luck or the competence of the men who worked under her, and every minor setback trumpeted as proof of female incompetence. But the ledgers told a truth that gossip could not obscure. Under Eleanor's management, the Ashford holdings were not merely surviving, they were thriving. What made Eleanor's position even more precarious was the constant social warfare being waged against her. She was excluded from every event that mattered, cut dead by women who had once called her friend, and subjected to a whisper campaign that painted her as everything from a grieving madwoman to a calculating seductress, using her widow's weeds to manipulate susceptible men. The isolation was crushing, but Eleanor had learned something important during those months. She could survive alone. She discovered a strength in solitude, a clarity that came from having no one's approval to seek but her own. She also found unexpected allies among the people society considered beneath her notice. The tenant farmers who praised her fairness, the factory workers whose children now attended decent schools because she had insisted on it, the shopkeepers and tradesmen who saw her as an honest dealer rather than an aristocrat demanding deference. These were not the allies that would gain her readmittance to society's inner circles, but they were the allies whose respect actually meant something. Sebastian Blackwell watched Eleanor's activities with growing irritation that he told himself was purely principled concern for social order, though if he had been honest with himself, he would have admitted there was something more complex at work. He found himself thinking about her far more than was warranted, found himself listening for news of her latest business dealings, found himself attending events he would normally have avoided simply because she might be there. He told himself it was vigilance, that someone needed to monitor this dangerous precedent she was setting, but the truth was that Eleanor Ashford had gotten under his skin in a way he found deeply unsettling. Every report of her competence felt like an accusation, every story of her kindness to her workers a reproach. Sebastian had convinced himself that maintaining rigid social hierarchies was the only way to prevent chaos, that women needed male protection, because they were naturally unsuited for the harsh realities of commerce and power. Eleanor's very existence challenged everything he believed, and he did not know whether he wanted to stop her or understand her. Their interactions became more frequent as business necessitated contact between neighboring estates. A disputed property line required negotiation. A shared water source needed agreements about usage. A joint investment in a local railway spur demanded coordination. Each meeting was a battle of wills conducted with frigid politeness, Sebastian arriving determined to overwhelm her with his authority and expertise, Eleanor meeting him with a composure that never cracked and a command of details that matched his own. He would present arguments for why she should defer to his judgment, and she would counter with data that proved her position superior. He would hint that she was operating beyond her natural capacities, and she would smile coldly and produce contracts that demonstrated otherwise. These encounters left Sebastian both frustrated and, though he would not yet acknowledge it, increasingly impressed. The turning point in their strange, hostile relationship came on an autumn afternoon when Sebastian arrived at Ashford Hall to discuss a timber contract and found Eleanor in the estate office, surrounded by ledgers, her black dress somehow making her look more commanding rather than diminished. There was something in her face that day, a weariness that spoke of battles fought alone for too long, and for the first time, Sebastian found himself wondering not what she was doing wrong, but what it cost her to do everything right. The question lodged in his mind like a splinter, and though he said nothing of it during their tense negotiation, he left that meeting troubled by a growing awareness that perhaps he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. Winter descended upon the English countryside with unusual severity that year, bringing with it storms that battered the estates and tested every resource Eleanor had carefully marshalled. The crisis came in late December, when one of the factory chimneys collapsed during a violent gale, injuring 3 workers and threatening to shut down production entirely, just as a critical contract deadline approached. Eleanor was on site within hours of receiving word, her black cloak whipping in the icy wind as she coordinated rescue efforts, arranged for the injured men to receive the best medical care available, and personally promised their families that wages would continue regardless of their ability to work. She then did something that scandalized the factory manager. She went into the workers' homes, sat at their rough tables, and listened to their concerns about safety and working conditions. By the time she returned to Ashford Hall 3 days later, exhausted and covered in soot, she had not only resolved the immediate crisis, but had also drafted plans for safety improvements across all her properties that would cost a fortune, but save lives. Sebastian heard about the incident through his own steward, who had witnessed Eleanor's response and spoke of it with an admiration that irritated the Duke beyond reason. He told himself that her behavior was theatrical, that she was courting popularity among the lower classes in some misguided attempt to compensate for her social failures among her peers. But something nagged at him, a small voice that asked uncomfortable questions. Would he have gone into those homes? Would he have sat with those families? Would he have seen the workers as people rather than assets to be managed? Sebastian had always considered himself a responsible landlord, but responsibility in his world meant ensuring adequate housing and fair wages, not personal involvement, not genuine connection. Eleanor's approach suggested a different philosophy entirely, one that challenged not just her society's conventions, but his own conception of what nobility actually meant. The weather forced them together in an unexpected way when a January blizzard stranded Sebastian at Ashford Hall following a business meeting that had run longer than anticipated. Eleanor could hardly turn away even her most persistent critic when the roads had become impassable and night was falling, so she offered him hospitality with cool courtesy, directing servants to prepare a guest room and informing him that dinner would be served at 8. Sebastian accepted with equal formality, but the forced proximity created an opportunity for observation that their usual brief, hostile encounters never permitted. He watched her manage her household with quiet efficiency, noticed how the servants responded to her with genuine respect rather than fear, observed the way she handled an emergency when a pipe burst in the east wing, not with hysterics, but with calm problem-solving that had the situation resolved within the hour. Dinner that evening was a peculiar affair, served in the intimate family dining room rather than the grand formal space, with just the two of them seated at opposite ends of a table that felt simultaneously too large and too small. They spoke carefully at first, keeping to safe topics like the weather and agricultural yields, but wine and exhaustion loosened tongues, and the conversation gradually shifted into more dangerous territory. Eleanor mentioned the factory improvements she was planning, and Sebastian, instead of immediately criticizing, found himself asking questions about her reasoning, her calculations, her vision for what such changes might accomplish. She answered him seriously, without defensiveness, laying out arguments that were both financially sound and morally compelling. He countered with concerns about setting precedents, about raising expectations that other landlords might not meet, and she responded that perhaps other landlords needed their expectations raised, that progress always required someone to lead rather than follow. What happened next was something neither of them had intended, a crack in the armor both wore so carefully. Sebastian found himself speaking about his own estate management, about the decisions he made and the traditions he upheld, and Eleanor listened with an attention that was neither judgmental nor admiring, but simply present. The conversation stretched past midnight, the fire burning low in the grate, and somewhere in those quiet hours, Sebastian began to see Eleanor not as a symbol of everything wrong with modern society, but as a person, brilliant, lonely, carrying burdens too heavy for anyone to bear alone, and doing it anyway because she had made a promise to a dead man she had loved. It was a dangerous recognition, one that threatened everything Sebastian had built his life upon, and as he finally retired to his guest room in the small hours of the morning, he felt the first tremors of a foundation beginning to shift. The thaw came not just to the frozen landscape, but to something far more unexpected, the icy distance between Sebastian Blackwell and Eleanor Ashford. In the weeks following that snowbound night, their interactions began to change in ways so subtle that neither could quite name when hostility had shifted into something more complex. Sebastian found reasons to call at Ashford Hall that went beyond strict business necessity, ostensibly to discuss shared concerns about spring planting or livestock disease, but lingering longer than such conversations required. Eleanor received him with a wariness that gradually softened into something approaching ease, and their discussions ranged far beyond estate management into philosophy, literature, and the great questions of duty versus progress that lay at the heart of their fundamental disagreement. They were not friends, certainly not allies, but they had become something perhaps more dangerous, two intelligent people who had discovered they enjoyed challenging each other's assumptions. Sebastian's transformation was not a sudden revelation, but a slow erosion of certainty, like water wearing away stone. Each encounter with Eleanor revealed another layer of her capability, her compassion, her unwavering integrity, and each revelation made his previous condemnations feel increasingly hollow. He watched her negotiate a labor dispute with such fairness that both workers and management left satisfied, something he had never managed to achieve in his own holdings. He witnessed her kindness to a tenant farmer who had fallen on hard times, extending credit and patience when any other landlord would have demanded immediate payment or eviction. He saw her poring over agricultural journals late into the evening, teaching herself new techniques that might improve yields and reduce hardship. And slowly, painfully, Sebastian began to understand that Eleanor was not destroying tradition. She was fulfilling its highest purpose, using privilege and power to protect and improve the lives of those who depended on her. The moment of true reckoning came on a soft April evening when Sebastian arrived at Ashford Hall to find Eleanor in Christopher's study, staring at a portrait of her late husband with an expression of such profound sorrow that it stopped Sebastian in his tracks. She had not heard him enter, and for a long moment he simply watched her. This woman who faced down bankers and defied society with unwavering strength, now revealed in her private grief as someone achingly human and unbearably alone. When she finally noticed his presence, she did not hide her tears or make excuses. She simply looked at him with eyes that held years of accumulated pain and said something that shattered the last of his resistance. She told him that she understood why he opposed her, that she knew her actions challenged everything he believed about how the world should work, but that she had made a promise to a good man who had seen her as more than society ever would, and she could not break that promise even if it meant spending the rest of her life as an outcast. Sebastian felt something crack open inside his chest, a dam breaking on emotions he had locked away for 4 long years. He found himself speaking words he had never intended to say, telling Eleanor about his own wife, Catherine, who had died in childbirth along with their son, and how he had blamed himself for not being there when she needed him, for being away on estate business when the labour began prematurely. He confessed that his rigid adherence to tradition was not really about principle, but about control, a desperate attempt to prevent the chaos and unpredictability that had stolen everything he loved. He admitted that watching Eleanor take risks, make bold decisions, step into spaces society forbade her to occupy, it terrified him because it reminded him that control was an illusion, that loss could come regardless of how carefully one followed the rules. His voice broke as he said that he had been wrong about her, that she was not reckless or improper, but rather the bravest person he had ever known, and that her courage made his cowardice unbearable to witness. Eleanor listened to this confession with tears streaming down her face, and when Sebastian finished speaking, she did something that changed everything between them. She crossed the room and took his hand, not with romantic intent, but with the simple human compassion of one grieving person recognizing another, and she told him that hiding from life to avoid loss was not honoring the dead. It was betraying them. Christopher had wanted her to live fully, to use her gifts to build and create and dare, and she believed Catherine would have wanted the same for Sebastian. They stood together in that quiet study, 2 people who had lost everything and were learning that perhaps they did not have to rebuild alone. And Sebastian knew with absolute certainty that his feelings for Eleanor Ashford had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He loved her, her strength, her kindness, her refusal to be diminished, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Sebastian Blackwell left Ashford Hall that April evening, a changed man. But change in a duke of his standing could not be a private affair, and he knew that what he did next would either redeem Eleanor in society's eyes or destroy them both. He spent sleepless nights wrestling with the magnitude of what he was contemplating, because to publicly support Eleanor meant repudiating everything he had said against her, admitting error before the entire aristocracy, and potentially damaging his own reputation beyond repair. But every time doubt crept in, he thought of her face in that study, of the strength it took to carry on alone, of the promise she kept to a dead husband while living people scorned her. He thought of his own cowardice, of how he had hidden behind tradition and propriety while she had dared to live authentically. And he knew with a clarity that felt like grace that he would rather stand beside Eleanor in disgrace than sit alone in hollow honor. His first move was calculated and deliberate. Sebastian began attending the few social events where Eleanor was still welcomed, and when others whispered or turned away from her, he made a point of seeking her out, of conversing with her openly, of treating her with the respect due to a competent estate manager, rather than a scandalous curiosity. The Ton noticed immediately, because Sebastian Blackwell did nothing without purpose, and his attention to the disgraced Viscountess Ashford sent shockwaves through drawing rooms across London. Speculation ran wild. Was the Duke courting her? Surely not. Was he attempting to bring her to heel through some elaborate strategy? Perhaps. No one could quite decipher his intentions, but the mere fact of his regard created a tiny crack in the wall of Eleanor's isolation, and a few brave souls began to follow his lead, treating her with cautious civility where before there had been only cutting remarks. Eleanor herself was bewildered and wary of this transformation. She had grown accustomed to Sebastian's opposition, had even come to rely on it as a kind of measuring stick for her own convictions, and his sudden support felt dangerous in ways his antagonism never had. She questioned his motives, wondered if this was some elaborate scheme to manipulate her into surrendering control of her estates, or perhaps to court her for her fortune, now that she had proven its value. But when she confronted him directly, demanding to know what game he was playing, Sebastian looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch and told her the simple truth. He had been wrong about everything, and he was trying to make amends the only way he knew how. He said that she had taught him that honor was not about following rules, but about doing what was right even when it cost everything, and that he would spend whatever time she allowed him proving that he had learned the lesson. The London season was approaching its peak, and with it came the event that would determine Eleanor's fate once and for all. The Royal Assembly Ball, the most prestigious gathering of the year, attended by everyone who mattered in English society. Eleanor had not received an invitation in 2 years, not since she had made her scandalous decision to manage her own affairs, and she had resigned herself to another season of exclusion. But then a cream-coloured envelope arrived bearing the royal seal, and inside was not just an invitation, but a personal note from the Queen's secretary indicating that Her Majesty had taken an interest in reports of the Viscountess Ashford's progressive estate management and looked forward to making her acquaintance. Eleanor knew immediately that this was Sebastian's doing, that he had somehow used his influence to secure not just her invitation, but royal interest. And the gesture was so audacious, so potentially disastrous for them both if it went wrong, that she hardly knew whether to be furious or grateful. Sebastian called on her the day after the invitation arrived, and this time there was no pretense of business discussion, no careful distance. He told her plainly that he had asked for this opportunity, that he had a plan that would either restore her to society or cement her exile forever, and that he needed her to trust him enough to attend the ball and follow his lead. Eleanor looked at this proud, powerful man who had been her fiercest critic and somehow become her most unlikely champion, and she made a decision that terrified her. She said yes, not because she understood his plan or believed it would work, but because somewhere in the past months she had begun to trust Sebastian Blackwell in ways she had trusted no one since Christopher's death. And if she was going to risk everything, she would rather do it beside him than alone. The stage was set for the most important night of Eleanor's life, and neither of them could predict whether it would end in triumph or disaster. The night of the Royal Assembly Ball arrived with the weight of destiny, and Eleanor prepared for it with the careful deliberation of a general before battle. She chose her gown with strategic precision, not the black of mourning that society expected, but a deep midnight blue silk that honored Christopher's memory, without proclaiming her a woman still bound to the grave. The dress was exquisitely made, its cut both modest and elegant, a statement that she was neither ashamed of her choices nor apologetic for her strength. Her maid dressed her hair in a style that was fashionable without being frivolous, and Eleanor examined herself in the mirror with a critical eye, seeing not the broken widow society had tried to make her, but a woman who had survived their worst and emerged undefeated. She knew that every eye would be upon her tonight, that every gesture would be scrutinized and every word weighed, and she steeled herself for an ordeal that would make her previous trials seem gentle by comparison. The assembly rooms blazed with candlelight when Eleanor's carriage arrived, and the moment she stepped through the doors, a hush fell over the glittering crowd like a curtain dropping on a stage. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, some shocked, some curious, many openly hostile, and Eleanor felt the full weight of their collective judgment pressing down upon her like a physical force. She had faced difficult moments before, had walked into rooms where she was unwelcome, and stood her ground against powerful men who sought to diminish her. But this was different in scale and consequence. This was the assembled might of English aristocracy, the arbiters of reputation and respectability, and they had already judged her and found her wanting. For a heartbeat, Eleanor's courage wavered, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in coming, if Sebastian's plan, whatever it was, could possibly overcome the enormous weight of disapproval that surrounded her like a wall. Then she saw him, standing near the center of the ballroom in his formal evening clothes, the Duke of Ravenscroft in all his considerable glory, and his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that steadied her shaking hands. Sebastian began moving toward her, cutting through the crowd with the absolute authority of a man who had never questioned his right to go wherever he pleased, and the whispers began immediately, rippling outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. What was the Duke doing? Surely he was not going to acknowledge her publicly, not here, not in front of everyone who mattered. But Sebastian reached Eleanor's side without hesitation, bowed with a formality that bordered on reverence, and then did something that shocked the entire assembly into stunned silence. He offered her his arm, and asked, in a voice pitched to carry across the room, if she would do him the extraordinary honor of granting him the first dance of the evening. Eleanor looked up at Sebastian, at this man who had opposed her so fiercely and now stood beside her so publicly, risking everything he was for reasons she still did not fully understand, and she saw in his eyes something that made her heart stutter in her chest. This was not strategy, not merely an attempt to rehabilitate her reputation through his influence. This was a declaration, made in the most public forum imaginable, that Sebastian Blackwell aligned himself with Eleanor Ashford completely and without reservation. By asking for the first dance, by treating her not as a scandal to be managed, but as a woman worthy of the highest respect, he was telling every person in that ballroom that their judgment of her was wrong and that he would stand against them all if necessary. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion, but she kept her composure, placed her hand on his arm with a grace that years of training had made instinctive, and allowed him to lead her onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. They danced under the weight of hundreds of staring eyes, moving together with a synchronicity that spoke of deeper connection than mere physical coordination. Sebastian held her as if she were precious, looked at her as if there were no one else in the room, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack open, a door she had sealed shut after Christopher's death, now yielding to unexpected possibility. She had not dared to imagine that she might ever be seen again as a woman rather than a cautionary tale, that she might ever be valued for more than her utility or scorned for her audacity. But here was Sebastian Blackwell, the most eligible and powerful man in England, choosing her publicly and unmistakably, and the choice was reverberating through the assembly rooms like thunder. This was only the beginning of what Sebastian had planned, Eleanor realized, and whatever came next would either transform her life or shatter it beyond all repair. The waltz ended, but Sebastian did not release Eleanor's hand, and the orchestra, sensing something momentous in the air, allowed silence to fall across the ballroom like snow. Every conversation ceased, every fan stopped moving, every breath seemed held, as Sebastian Blackwell turned to face the assembled aristocracy with Eleanor at his side. What happened next would be recounted in drawing rooms for decades to come, passed down as the night when the most powerful duke in England did the unthinkable. Sebastian's voice, trained from birth to command attention and respect, rang out across the glittering space with absolute clarity and unmistakable conviction. He announced that he had called for this moment of collective attention because he had a matter of great importance to address, and he would brook no interruption until he had finished speaking. Sebastian began by acknowledging his own failures, a confession so unexpected from a man of his rank that it sent fresh ripples of shock through the crowd. He stated plainly that he had been wrong in his previous condemnation of Viscountess Eleanor Ashford, that he had allowed prejudice and fear to cloud his judgment, and that he had spoken against her when he should have been her most ardent defender. He detailed her accomplishments with the Ashford estates, citing specific figures that demonstrated not just competence but brilliance, how she had increased revenues by 40% while simultaneously improving worker conditions, how she had negotiated contracts that benefited both her holdings and the wider community, how she had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that intelligence and capability had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. His words were not flattery but fact, delivered with the precision of a man presenting evidence in a court of law, and the gathered aristocracy listened in stunned silence because Sebastian Blackwell was not a man given to empty praise or emotional exaggeration. Then Sebastian pivoted to a broader indictment, one that made uncomfortable truths impossible to ignore. He spoke about the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to value honor and duty, while denying those virtues when they appeared in unexpected forms, that praised men for the same actions it condemned in women, that wrapped cruelty in the language of propriety and called exclusion righteousness. He pointed out that many of the men in that very room managed their estates poorly, gambled away fortunes, neglected their responsibilities to tenants and workers, yet faced no social censure because they had the advantage of being born male. He asked what kind of civilization punished competence and rewarded mediocrity simply based on arbitrary characteristics of birth, and whether they were truly prepared to defend such a system when confronted with its absurdity. The silence in the ballroom had shifted from shocked to deeply uncomfortable, because Sebastian was not merely defending Eleanor. He was holding up a mirror to the entire social order and forcing them to see their own reflection. But Sebastian was not finished, and what came next was the moment that would define not just that evening, but the rest of Eleanor's life. He turned to face her fully, still holding her hand, and his expression softened from the stern judgment he had directed at the crowd to something infinitely tender and utterly genuine. He said that in witnessing Eleanor's courage, her integrity, her unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of cost, he had learned what true nobility meant, and he had fallen deeply and irrevocably in love with her. The gasps that greeted this declaration were audible across the entire ballroom, but Sebastian ignored them completely, focused only on Eleanor as he spoke words that made tears spring to her eyes. He said that she had transformed him from a man hiding behind rules into someone brave enough to live authentically, that she had shown him that honoring the dead meant embracing life rather than retreating from it, and that he would consider it the greatest privilege of his existence if she would consent to become his wife. Then, before God and the Queen and every member of English high society, Sebastian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenscroft, descendant of kings and one of the wealthiest men in the empire, lowered himself to one knee before Eleanor Ashford, the scandalous widow they had all scorned, and asked her to marry him. The ballroom erupted into chaos, shocked exclamations, delighted whispers, a few scandalized protests, but all of it faded into background noise as Eleanor looked down at this extraordinary man who had somehow seen past society's blindness to recognize her true worth. She was trembling, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, by the public nature of this vindication she had never dared to dream possible. Sebastian gazed up at her with absolute certainty, waiting for her answer with the patience of a man who knew he was offering not just his name and title, but his whole heart. And Eleanor realized that she had a choice before her that would determine not just her future, but the kind of woman she would be for the rest of her life. Eleanor looked down at Sebastian, at this man kneeling before her in front of everyone who had ever dismissed her worth, and she felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a mantle. She could accept stepping into the highest rank of English nobility and securing not just her own vindication, but a partnership with someone who truly understood her. Or she could refuse, maintaining her hard-won independence but remaining forever on society's margins. But as Eleanor gazed into Sebastian's eyes, she realized that this was not actually a choice between security and freedom, between love and autonomy. Sebastian was not asking her to surrender what she had built or to become a decorative duchess who existed only to reflect his glory. He was offering her something far more rare and precious, a true partnership between equals, a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values, a union where her strength would be celebrated rather than suppressed. And so Eleanor spoke her answer in a voice that carried across the hushed ballroom with perfect clarity, a single word that would change everything. Yes. The moment Eleanor accepted, Sebastian rose to his feet and kissed her hand with such reverence that even the most hardened critics found themselves unexpectedly moved. The ballroom remained suspended in stunned silence for several heartbeats, and then something remarkable happened. One person began to applaud, Lady Pemberton, the brave hostess who had never stopped inviting Eleanor to her salons, and the sound was quickly joined by others. Not everyone, certainly. There were those who turned away in disgust or left the ball entirely in protest. But enough people applauded, enough voices rose in congratulation that the tide of public opinion visibly shifted in that glittering room. The Queen herself, watching from her position of honor, smiled and nodded her approval, and that royal endorsement sealed Eleanor's transformation from scandal to success. Within moments, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of them the same people who had cut her dead only hours before, now eager to claim they had always admired her spirit or known she would triumph eventually. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but Eleanor accepted their congratulations with grace, because this night was not about punishing her former tormentors, but about claiming the future she deserved. Sebastian stood beside her throughout the receiving of congratulations, his hand at the small of her back, a subtle but unmistakable statement of support and possession. He deflected attempts to separate them, insisting that any conversation with him must include his betrothed, and Eleanor felt a fierce gratitude for the way he made it clear that her elevation was not merely reflected glory from his choice, but recognition of her inherent worth. When several gentlemen attempted to discuss business with Sebastian alone, he redirected them to Eleanor, noting that she had far more innovative ideas about estate management than he did, and they would be wise to seek her counsel. The shock on their faces was almost comical, but Sebastian's absolute seriousness made it impossible to dismiss his words as mere gallantry. He was, Eleanor realized, using this moment not just to restore her reputation, but to fundamentally change how these powerful men thought about women's capabilities, one conversation at a time. As the evening wore on and the initial frenzy of reaction settled into more normal celebration, Sebastian managed to steal a private moment with Eleanor on a balcony overlooking the garden. Away from the crowds and the noise, he took both her hands in his and asked if she truly understood what she had agreed to, if she was certain that marriage to him was what she wanted rather than what she felt obligated to accept. Eleanor looked at this man who had opposed her, then defended her, then loved her, and she told him the truth that had been growing in her heart for months. She said that she had loved Christopher with the affection of friendship and partnership, but what she felt for Sebastian was something different and deeper, forged in conflict and tempered by mutual transformation. She loved him not despite their battles, but because of them, because he had been willing to change his entire worldview when confronted with truth, because he had risked everything to stand beside her, because he saw her not as a woman to be managed, but as a partner to be cherished. Sebastian pulled her close then, propriety forgotten in the privacy of the balcony, and kissed her with a passion that spoke of months of denied attraction finally unleashed. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, tasting possibility and promise, and the sweet vindication of being chosen not for her bloodline or her fortune, but for herself, wholly and completely. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Sebastian told her that their marriage would be a scandal in itself because he intended to continue consulting her on every decision, to value her judgment above all his male advisers, and to make it abundantly clear to all of England that the Duchess of Ravenscroft was no mere ornament, but the most formidable partner he could have found. Eleanor smiled and said that sounded absolutely perfect, and as they stood together looking out over the gardens, they both knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter of a story that would reshape what was possible. The wedding of Sebastian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenscroft, to Eleanor Ashford took place 6 weeks later in a ceremony that was both traditional in form and revolutionary in substance. Eleanor walked down the aisle not as a woman being transferred from one man's authority to another's, but as an equal partner, entering a union of mutual respect and shared purpose. The church was filled with everyone who mattered in English society, many of whom had scorned her mere months before, but now competed for the honor of claiming friendship with the future Duchess. Eleanor saw through their sudden affection with clear eyes, but she held no bitterness, because she had learned something valuable through her ordeal. She did not need their approval to have worth, and their belated recognition changed nothing about who she had always been. The vows she and Sebastian exchanged were the traditional words, but both knew they carried deeper meaning, a promise not just of fidelity but of partnership, of supporting each other's growth rather than demanding conformity, of building something together that neither could create alone. As the Duchess of Ravenscroft, Eleanor discovered that Sebastian had meant every word of his public declarations. He genuinely consulted her on estate management decisions, introduced her to his business partners as an equal, and made it clear throughout his holdings that the Duchess's word carried the same weight as his own. Together, they implemented reforms across both their properties, improving worker conditions, investing in education and infrastructure, and proving that progressive policies could be both morally right and financially successful. Eleanor's innovative approaches to agriculture and industry became a model that other estates began cautiously to follow, and within a few years, what had once been scandalous was becoming, if not commonplace, at least possible. She never forgot the Ashford estates either, maintaining active oversight of Christopher's legacy and ensuring that his progressive vision continued to thrive. Sebastian supported this completely, understanding that honoring her first husband's memory did not diminish what they had built together, but rather enriched it. Their marriage was blessed with children, first a daughter who inherited Eleanor's intelligence and Sebastian's determination, then twin sons who kept the nursery in cheerful chaos, and Eleanor proved that women could be both mothers and managers, both tender and strong, both nurturing and commanding. She raised her daughter to believe that her gender was not a limitation, but simply a characteristic, no more defining than the color of her hair, and she taught her sons that strength included the courage to admit error and the wisdom to respect capability wherever it appeared. The Ravenscroft children grew up in a household where their mother's voice mattered as much as their father's, where decisions were discussed rather than dictated, and where love was demonstrated through mutual respect and shared responsibility. They carried those lessons into the next generation, slowly changing the aristocracy from within through the simple but radical act of treating women as fully human. Eleanor lived to see Victoria ascend the throne, witness the expansion of railways across England, and watch the world transform in ways both wonderful and terrible. She never stopped managing estates, never retreated into purely decorative domesticity, and never apologized for the choices that had once made her a scandal. In her later years, young women would seek her out, asking how she had found the courage to defy society's expectations, and Eleanor would tell them the truth. She had not been brave, she had simply been unable to live with the alternative. She would explain that worth was not granted by others' approval, but discovered in one's own integrity, that the hardest battles were often fought against the limitations people tried to impose rather than any external enemy, and that love, real love, required seeing and being seen completely. She told them that vindication was sweet, but self-respect was sweeter still, and that they should never ever make themselves smaller to fit into spaces that were too confining for their spirits. And now, dear listener, as Eleanor's story draws to a close, perhaps you find yourself thinking about your own life, about the spaces where you have made yourself smaller, about the times you have sought approval from those who could never truly see your worth. Eleanor's journey was set in a different time, but its truth is timeless. You do not need permission to be extraordinary. You do not need consensus to pursue what is right, and you do not need society's validation to have value. The people who diminish you are revealing their own limitations, not defining yours. Like Eleanor, you may face a choice between acceptance and authenticity, between fitting in and standing out, between the comfortable cage of others' expectations and the terrifying freedom of your own potential. Choose freedom, dear listener. Choose authenticity. Choose to be so undeniably excellent at what you do that even your critics must eventually acknowledge your worth. And if you are blessed enough to find someone who sees you completely, who celebrates your strength rather than fearing it, who stands beside you in your battles rather than demanding you fight alone, hold on to that person as Eleanor held on to Sebastian, because that kind of love, that kind of partnership, is rarer than diamonds and more precious than any title. You are not too much. You are not inappropriate. You are not unwomanly or unfeminine or any other word designed to make you doubt your own magnificence. You are exactly enough, exactly right, exactly as you should be. Now go forth and prove it, just as Eleanor did, one brave choice at a time.